There's a question Scottish historians tend to avoid answering directly, and it's not about ghosts or lost battles. It's about a family. A family that, according to legend, lived hidden inside a sea cave for 25 years, feeding on travelers who vanished along the desolate roads of Galloway. His name was Alexander Bean, known as Sawney Bean. And the story that has circulated about him for centuries is so detailed, so disturbing, so carefully constructed, that most people never stop to ask whether any of it is true. That's exactly what we're going to do today. I'm not going to promise you censored revelations or buried secrets. What I will do is tell this story the way it deserves to be told, with everything it has that's macabre, and with everything it has that's suspicious. Because sometimes the most disturbing narrative isn't the one about the family in the cave. It's the one about the society that needed them to exist. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And if this is your first time on the channel, welcome. What you'll find here isn't easy entertainment. It's investigation. If that's what you came for, subscribe. Scotland in 1590 was not the postcard country of misty castles and green pastures. It was a broken country. The feudal system had turned entire generations into disposable labor, peasants breaking their backs on land that would never be theirs, paying taxes to lords who didn't know their names. Winter wasn't a season, it was a death sentence. Entire families vanished between November and March, not through violence, but through exhaustion and silent starvation. It's in that soil, not in the supernatural, not in innate evil, that the story of Sawney Bean begins. Alexander Bean was born the son of a man who had spent his entire life digging ditches and graves for anonymous masters. There are no precise records of Alexander, no baptismal registry, no contemporary mention of him. What exists are later versions of his story, all beginning in the same place: a refusal to accept his father's fate. By 16, the road ahead of him was drawn with brutal clarity. He would be another anonymous rural worker, dying young and nameless, like his father and grandfather before him. Something in him refused that, not heroically, but in the way despair sometimes turns into revolt. The woman who changed his trajectory was named Agnes Douglas. The villagers called her Black Agnes, and the reputation she carried was not small. They said she knew things she shouldn't, secrets whispered only between husband and wife, sins committed in darkness, fears never spoken aloud, which most likely means she was too intelligent for the comfort of everyone around her, observant, disturbingly perceptive in an era when those qualities in a woman had an official name: witchcraft. We're at the height of King James VI's witch persecutions, the same king who wrote entire treatises on the subject and genuinely believed he had survived supernatural attempts on his life. In that context, a woman like Agnes had no safe space within the society that existed. The stake was a permanent possibility, not a metaphor. When Alexander and Agnes found each other, what bound them wasn't the stuff of fairy tales. It was something simpler and darker. They both had more to lose by staying than by leaving. The night they fled, Alexander took his former master's best horse. Agnes took whatever she carried inside her, and they rode southwest, through increasingly desolate landscapes, until they reached the wild coast of Galloway. It was Agnes who noticed the crack in the rock, an opening so narrow it seemed impossible it could lead anywhere significant. She was exhausted and desperate enough to investigate anything that resembled shelter. When the tide went out that first night, the opening revealed a passage. What lay beyond it would change everything. The cave sits at Benane Head, on the southwest coast of Scotland, between Girvan and Ballantrae. It stretches more than 600 feet deep, the equivalent of 2 football fields lined end to end, and its entrance floods with the tide twice a day. At high tide, it simply doesn't exist. It becomes part of the rock. The surrounding coastline was treacherous, full of reefs and unpredictable currents, and local fishermen avoided it for practical reasons that produced the same result as any superstition. No one came near. The interior formed a network of tunnels and chambers that stayed completely dry even during storms. The acoustics returned sounds distorted, as if words were being chewed before coming back. Alexander and Agnes had found the only place in Scotland where they could exist without being found. The first winter nearly killed them anyway. Before the story moves forward, there's an older legend that needs to be mentioned, because it will matter in ways that become important later. In the mid-14th century, during one of the worst famines medieval Scotland ever recorded, a butcher from Perth named Andrew Christie made a choice that immortalized him in a macabre way. Christie was leading a group of men through the hills when one of them starved to death. What happened next entered Scottish culture as the legend of Christie Cleek. Cleek being the old Scottish word for hook, the instrument Christie allegedly used to drag travellers from their horses. The hook was long, with barbs that made it impossible for victims to break free. Christie reportedly killed at least 30 people before his group was dispersed. He was never captured. Legend says he reintegrated into normal society, remarried, had children, and took his secrets to the grave. That legend was solidly embedded in Scottish culture when the story of Sawney Bean began to circulate. The similarities are too direct to be coincidence, but the right moment to explore that is still ahead. The cold came through the rock like the stone was paper. They ate what there was: fish caught in tidal pools, shellfish, seaweed. When that ran out, they ate the leather of their own boots, boiled until it became a tasteless, nutritionless paste. There were nights when Agnes simply stopped moving, conserving every calorie that remained. It was during one of those nights that Alexander heard footsteps on the path above the cave. A lone traveler, a merchant, if the legend is to be believed. Alexander didn't plan carefully. Hunger had reduced his thinking to pure instinct. He stepped out of the shadows, knocked the man from his horse, and the rest happened too quickly to be called a decision. What came next, with the body, was Agnes's idea. I'm not going to describe that in details that add nothing but gratuitous revulsion. What matters is what that moment represented. A line was crossed, and once crossed, it never existed again. What disturbs me, looking at the brutal logic of that situation, isn't that they got there. It's that most of us like to believe we never would, and we're probably right. But we've also never spent a winter eating boot leather in a cave on the edge of the Atlantic. In the months that followed, the pattern established itself. Alexander developed techniques that grew increasingly elaborate. Ropes stretched between trees to knock riders down, traps covered with branches. He also built his own version of the hook from the Christie Cleek legend, forged iron with metal stolen from the roads, with barbs that made it impossible for victims to break free. Agnes became a specialist in preservation. Sea salt collected from tidal pools, wood ash, techniques that the legend describes as efficient enough to keep meat for months. Not out of cruelty, at least not at first. Out of the same necessity that makes people in extreme situations unrecognizable to themselves. They also expanded the cave. Stone walls dividing the space into functional compartments. A ventilation system that carried smoke through natural rock fissures and dispersed it at distant points along the coast. It was primitive engineering, but functional. The kind that intelligent, desperate people build when the alternative is being found. In the winter of 1591, Agnes gave birth to their first child. No midwife, no blessing, no saint's name. The baby was born in absolute silence, and there was no way to raise that child within any recognizable structure of family or society. Everything it would ever learn would come from those two adults, those stone walls, that routine of darkness and tide. The first sounds it learned to distinguish weren't words. They were the communication signals Alexander and Agnes had developed for hunting without speaking. A low whistle for prey spotted nearby, a guttural grunt to set the trap, a tongue click to attack. That child grew up believing this was language, that this was the world. And here is the detail that strikes me as the most disturbing thing in this entire story. More than anything physical, that child was not being raised as a monster. It was being raised inside the only reality that existed for it. That doesn't justify a single thing the Bean family did, but it's different from an adult who chooses evil with full awareness of what they're refusing. And that difference matters, not to absolve, but to understand the real mechanism of what happened in that cave over decades. Agnes had 8 sons and 6 daughters. None of them ever attended a school, a church, or a village. When they began to couple with each other, because there was no one else, the Bean family began to become something beyond 2 fugitives and their children. It began to become a bloodline closed in on itself. On the roads of Galloway, travelers kept disappearing. Merchants who never reached their destination. Families who left one village and never arrived at the next. Authorities blamed bandits, wolves, road accidents. Nobody looked inside a cave the tide hid twice a day. 25 years is a long time. It's enough time for a decision made on a desperate night to become a complete structure, with its own hierarchy, its own rules, and a worldview so distorted that no one living inside it could see the distortion. The Bean family reached 46 members, 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandsons and 14 granddaughters, all born in the cave, all products of generations of inbreeding, with no new blood entering that lineage for 25 years. The physical consequences were visible in some. Limb deformities, facial asymmetries. Genetics has limits that become evident when a population closes in on itself for decades. As for the legend of the sharpened teeth, that Bean children had fangs like animals, that's the kind of detail oral tradition amplifies with every generation of storytellers. That children raised in that environment developed habits that damaged their enamel, or used abrasive stones in ways healthy children never would, is possible. Fangs like animals is the version that sells. They're not the same thing. Children who never saw direct sunlight in their first years of life, who grew up in an environment where every sense was constantly demanded in ways normal children never experience, there's no need to reach for the supernatural to imagine what that does to a human being in development. The result on its own is disturbing enough. The cave had been transformed over decades. 2 chambers had distinct and permanent functions. The first was where the work that sustained the family happened, with an efficiency that came from decades of repeated practice, and that is disturbing precisely because of that. Not because of the violence itself, but because of how completely it had become routine. The second was deeper in, set apart, and was where something that remotely resembled family life took place, where children slept, where meals were eaten. That second chamber is what occupies me most when I think about this story. Not the processing room, not the hooks. The space where children grew up believing that was normal, where a family meal carried the same emotional weight, comfort, belonging, routine, that it does in any other family, with the difference that no one from outside could describe it without losing their footing. That was the world the eldest son grew up in, and the world that made him. The versions of the legend don't document the names of the Bean children with consistency. I'll refer to him here as the eldest son, because naming with certainty what has no historical confirmation would be inventing, and that's not what we're doing. What the accounts describe about him is consistent enough to deserve attention. He was fundamentally different from his father. Alexander killed out of necessity and hid out of discipline. The discipline of someone who had lived on the other side and knew exactly what he lost by existing outside of society. The eldest son had no such memory. He had been born in the cave. The roads above weren't a world he had fled from. They were simply a source of resources. And what he had, in place of his father's survival instinct, was curiosity about power. Over the years, he developed the habit of forcing those who could still speak to tell him things. The legend mentions a priest kept alive long enough to teach rudimentary Latin before he no longer could. It's worth being honest about that detail. Someone in extreme trauma and with serious injuries cannot teach anything coherently. What he probably extracted were fragments, isolated words, phrases memorized without real context. But it was enough to create something new within the Bean family, the illusion of intellectual superiority over his father. That made him more dangerous than Alexander, not less. The tension between them grew like a crack in a stone wall. Alexander understood that survival depended on complete anonymity. The eldest son wanted the world to know they existed, that they were a force, that the roads of Galloway belonged to them. What destroys families that survive decades in the shadows is almost never a police investigation. It's almost always the moment when someone inside the group starts believing they're invincible. For the Bean family, that moment had one author, the eldest son, around 1614. The first manifestation of his new philosophy came at an isolated farm in the hills. What the family did there wasn't a pragmatic ambush. It was a declaration. The livestock were eviscerated and hung from the trees. The horses were left with broken legs to suffer. The farming family was arranged around the dinner table as if about to begin a meal, their bodies opened and repositioned into a grotesque domestic scene that had no utilitarian function whatsoever. It was a signature. Local authorities were paralyzed by the scene. Wolves, some said. Irish bandits, others suggested. Nobody wanted to articulate what the physical evidence implied, that there was intelligence behind it, that it wasn't animal predation. In the months that followed, more attacks, each one louder than the last, each one harder to explain away. The Bean family had stopped operating in the shadows. A shepherd who survived one of these attacks by hiding was the first to give authorities a coherent account. He described figures covered in ash and dried blood, moving like a pack, coordinated, silent, with children of 6 or 7 working with the efficiency of adults. And he described a small child using a victim's intestines as a jump rope, leaping with the lightness of someone who genuinely didn't understand what they had in their hands. That detail was what made authorities stop talking about wolves. The attack that finally reached Edinburgh was the ambush of a noble caravan in 1615, a wealthy family returning from pilgrimage, accompanied by experienced guards and traveling in carriages. The eldest son had planned the operation weeks in advance. Trees felled to block the road, traps for the horses, and, the coldest detail of the entire operation, the bodies of previous victims positioned along the road as if they were resting travelers. When the caravan stopped to offer help, they realized they were surrounded by decomposing corpses that had been arranged as bait. One man survived. Pinned beneath the weight of a dead horse during the ambush, he lay still long enough to witness what the Bean family did after a successful hunt. What he saw doesn't need to be described in detail. What matters is what he carried when he crawled for days until reaching the nearest village, a severed arm from a noble child, with cut marks too clean to be the work of an animal and evidence of processing, preservation techniques that were not accidental. When he reached the village gates and collapsed, what he managed to say was, "There's a family, in a cave, under the rock." The royal physicians who examined the physical evidence confirmed it. Precise cuts, human teeth marks on the bones, signs of intentional preservation. This was not the work of opportunistic bandits. It was the work of people who had refined a practice over decades. James VI was not a man given to incredulity when the subject was human evil. He had written entire treatises on the matter. His decree was immediate. An expedition would march south. 400 men, knights, trackers, armed clerics, dogs trained to track human blood, cartographers and scribes to document everything. You don't mobilize 400 men over a rumor. The dogs arrived first. They had been trained to track human blood, and when they approached the Galloway coast, they grew agitated in a way their handlers later described as unlike any hunt before. Not the excited behavior of a dog on a scent. Something closer to reluctance, as if two instincts were pulling against each other. The cave entrance was located at low tide, exactly as the survivor had described, a fissure in the rock that didn't stand out from hundreds of other formations along the coast. The smell came before the entrance. Men who had treated gangrene wounds on battlefields said afterward it was unlike anything they knew. Not just decomposition, but something more worked, as if the very air had been saturated by years of specific, continuous activity. When they lit their torches and entered, they found a place that had been profoundly modified by human hands over many years. Stone walls dividing the space into compartments. A crude ventilation construction integrated into the rock. Bones organized, not scattered randomly. Tools. Preserved meat. It was not a den. It was a domestic structure. And somehow, that was more disturbing than anything the soldiers had imagined finding. In the deeper chambers, they found the family. 46 people. Most had never left the cave. Abruptly exposed to torchlight after years of near-total darkness, the disorientation was physical, not performed. Some pressed themselves against the walls. Others made the guttural sounds the shepherd had described. Children who had never seen a torch in their lives reacted to the light as if it were an assault. Alexander Bean was found in a side chamber staring at the wall. He didn't resist when he was taken. The words the legend attributes to him, "We were hungry, and you forgot us," may be a later invention, constructed by whoever told this story decades afterward. But as an invention, they are disturbingly perfect, because they put in the mouth of a monster a sentence that is historically very difficult to argue with. Agnes was dead. They found her in a deep chamber, knees folded, fingers still tracing patterns in the dirt floor. There is no record of when she died, or of what. She had simply stopped at some point before the soldiers arrived, in the gesture she had repeated for decades, as if the movement itself was the only thing still keeping her somewhere recognizable as a human mind. The eldest son fought until he couldn't anymore. When he was finally brought down, there was nothing left of him but the fight itself. There was no trial. The royal decree was sufficient, and the execution followed the legal standards for crimes considered beyond redemption. What the accounts mention, and what has stayed with me since I first read them, isn't the violence of the execution itself. It's the silence. Most people being executed scream, beg, pray. The Bean children died making the guttural sounds they had learned in the cave, not out of supernatural courage, but because they had never learned the human words for fear, pain, or pleading. There had never been anyone to teach them. The cave was sealed. Life moved on. Here's the problem. After all of that, 25 years of terror on the roads of Galloway, the expedition of 400 men, the public executions, there is not a single official document from the time that confirms any of it actually happened. James VI was a monarch who documented everything, especially his victories against evil. He wrote entire treatises on witchcraft, kept detailed records of every execution for sorcery, every conspiracy dismantled. If he had truly led a 400-man expedition that destroyed a cannibal family operating in a secret cave for 25 years, that would have been the greatest victory of his reign. He never would have stopped talking about it. In the Royal Archives, total silence. Dr. Louise Yeoman, a historian working with the archives of the National Library of Scotland, put it directly. If Sawney Bean were real, James VI would never have stopped talking about him. The silence of the Royal Archives is, in the end, the loudest evidence of all. The earliest surviving written version of the story appears in 1775 in the Newgate Calendar, an English publication that blended real crimes with sensationalist fiction and was one of the best-selling printed works of its era. In modern terms, it was the equivalent of a tabloid. Fascinating, frequently inaccurate, and enormously popular. Not by coincidence, 1775 is also the period when the relationship between England and Scotland was politically charged, still weighted by the Jacobite uprisings of 1715, 1719, and 1745, with England needing to justify increasingly harsh control policies over Scottish territory. Samuel Johnson himself wrote about the Scots with a hostility that would be difficult to publish today. The noblest prospect which a Scotchman ever sees is the high road that leads him to England. The name Sawney wasn't a name. It was an insult, a derogatory version of Sandy that had become synonymous with crude, primitive Scotsman. The English even had a cartoon character called Sawney Happorth, literally, Scotsman worth half a penny, a reference to the fact that £1 was worth 12 Scottish pounds at the time. The insult was mathematical. A story about a Sawney who lived in a cave, ate human beings, and raised 46 incestuous descendants, published exactly within the context of 18th century anti-Scottish propaganda, is not difficult to contextualize. There's also the fact that the legend of Christy Cleek, the Perth butcher with the hook, the accomplice family, decades of undetected operation, was documented in Scottish culture since the 15th century, long before Sawney Bean appeared in any text. The central elements of the Bean story already existed, under another name, in another era. Around 1750, street pamphlets circulating in England were already attaching modified versions of that same legend to contemporary crimes, showing the narrative was being recycled and repurposed to serve different ends at different moments. As for the last words the legend attributes to the eldest son, "You cannot kill what made us." It should be said that this line appears in 18th and 19th century versions of the story, long after the events supposedly took place. It's the kind of phrase a writer constructs for a character when they need him to carry the thematic weight of what comes next. It may have been spoken, it probably wasn't. But as a narrative construction, it's disturbingly precise. Because what made us is exactly what we need to question. And then there is Snib Scott, and this is the detail that stopped me cold when I first came across it. Between 1950 and 1983, a man known locally as Snib Scott left a comfortable life in Dundee to live as a hermit on the Galloway coast. The cave he chose was Benane Cave, the same one the legend claims the Bean family occupied for 25 years. Snib Scott spent more than 3 decades modifying that cave. He built stone masonry walls. He installed a fireplace with a ventilation system. He constructed a second wall with a door-like opening separating the back of the cave from the entrance. Locals knew him, respected him, and sometimes left food for him. He died of pneumonia in the winter of 1983. The cave is officially known as Snib's Cave among local residents, a tribute to the only verifiable inhabitant it ever had. The walls he built still stand. The remains of the fireplace still exist. When visitors arrive expecting bones and hooks, they find stone, mortar, and a blocked window. When the soldiers in the legend entered that cave and found stone masonry walls, a functional fireplace, organized compartments, they were finding the cave the legend described. But the physical cave that matches that description was built by an eccentric hermit of the 20th century, not by the Beans. That doesn't prove the legend is false, but it complicates in a fascinating way the question of where the details came from and when. In 1977, Wes Craven released The Hills Have Eyes, one of the most influential horror films of the 20th century, about an isolated family that attacks travelers. Craven confirmed in interviews that the direct inspiration was the legend of Sawney Bean. The story that may never have happened generated one of the most iconic monster families in cinema, which in turn spawned remakes, imitations, and an entire lineage of American horror. The monster that may have been fabricated to dehumanize a people kept multiplying, taking new shapes, haunting new generations. So, did Sawney Bean exist? There may have been some real criminal whose crimes were amplified through generations of oral tradition. The story may have been built on the bones of Christy Cleek, dressed in different clothes with a different address. Or it was manufactured outright, a propaganda tool deployed at the precise moment England most needed a Scottish monster. What definitely existed was the need to tell this story. And that need to create specific monsters with specific geographies at specific political moments did not end in the 18th century. The question this legend should leave you with isn't, did Sawney Bean exist? It's, what did a society need to believe in order to need him to exist? Who benefited when Scots were cannibals in caves and the English were the 400 heroes arriving to save civilization? Recognizing that mechanism is the first step toward not being consumed by it. Because it didn't disappear. It changed names and updated its vocabulary. But the structure never changed. First you dehumanize, then you justify, then you record the story as if it were inevitable. Benane Head Cave still exists. The walls Snib Scott built are still there, and the story of Sawney Bean is still being sold as entertainment, in souvenirs, in films, in videos like this one. Tell me in the comments, do you think Sawney Bean was real, or do you think he was built? Think about it before you answer, because your response says more about how you process fear than about what actually happened on that coastline in the 16th century. Until the next investigation,